Well, jeepers! You're listening to Smash or Pass.
Hello everyone, welcome back to another interview on the JayBee and Milly channel. I am JayBee and of course with me is Milly.
Hi.
And the special guest who will be interviewing today is Mr Semper. Thank you so much for joining.
It is my pleasure.
Well, thank you so much. I mean, many people watching this will know you from an amazing career that you've got with as a writer, story editor, producer, and just pioneering so many things in that regard. But before that point, at the start of your career, or even before that, what made you go down that path?
Well, I knew from a very early age that I wanted to be involved in making cartoons. I was a big fan of Disney. I think the first feature film I ever saw was a Disney movie when I was coming of age, when I was young enough to really comprehend what was going on. Sleeping Beauty had a huge effect on me. It was just a magnificent achievement in cinema. And I thought to myself, if something like this widescreen, stereophonic, beautiful movie can come from drawing on a piece of paper, then this is really a medium that I want to be in. So really from about age 6, I decided I wanted to be involved in cartoons. And in a way, that's sort of always been my secret weapon, because certainly in the 80s when I got going, the desired career that most people who wanted to get into the industry wanted was to be in television, and to be in live action television and in movies. And I really wanted to be in cartoons, which was kind of a place where nobody wanted to be. So I think it really kind of helped my career that I always wanted to be in cartoons.
I certainly think, like you said, Disney is inspirational to so many people from such a young age. I think it's something that everybody gravitates towards. And like you said, that certainly got you set on the path. So from there, did you kind of find any creators or anything like that in terms of artists, or even any other shows as well that inspired you going along with that route?
Well, back in those days, for kids, the very beginning of Hanna Barbera was happening. So when I was a kid, the first Hanna Barbera cartoon show hit the airwaves, syndicated, and it would have been Huckleberry Hound. And since they were cartoons, and they were the only cartoons really that you could watch at that time on TV, that had a huge influence on me. And one of my pleasures when I finally ended up being a staff writer at Hanna Barbera was that so many of the people who had made those cartoons that I had watched when I was a kid were still at Hanna Barbera. So it was really, I mean, literally, if any office that I poked my head into had a hero of mine in one form or other. And I ended up writing for a lot of the voices, the voice talent that I had grown up really loving and admiring as a kid. So yeah, Hanna-Barbera was a huge influence, simply because they were the only ones really making cartoons. And then every once in a while, I just wrote this online recently, before Saturday morning cartoons arrived, because I'm old enough that I was a kid watching TV on Saturday morning before the networks had started programming Saturday morning cartoons. And they used to run, the local TV stations used to run a lot of public domain cartoons for kids, just locally. And a lot of it was garbage. A lot of it was old Pharma Alfalfa cartoons, which were silent cartoons that had a music track, and they were really awful. But then every once in a while, something would come across out of this grab bag of stuff. You might get a Lottie Reininger silhouette fairy tale film. She was a German filmmaker who made lovely films, all in silhouette, paper cutout films, and they were stunning. And one of those might appear. Her most famous film is called Prince Ahmed. And then the Max Fleischer Superman cartoons, which were just amazing, just stunning. Here was Disney quality animation devoted to a superhero straight out of the comic book. So nobody was doing superheroes back in the 1930s when they made those cartoons, 30s and 40s. And B, the quality of the animation was stunning. So for it to suddenly appear on Saturday morning while I was sitting there in front of the TV was just mind-blowing. So those were Those were my early influences: Disney, Hanna-Barbera, and then the one or two gems that would come across on syndicated television.
Well, it certainly is amazing, like you say, to hear how you went from watching Warner Brothers to then, like you say, walking down the hallway and practically every room had one of those childhood heroes in it. And I think, you know, a lot of people that listen to these podcasts certainly aspire to have roles, you know, such as the career that you've had. And so to those people, what advice do you have? Obviously, knowing from such a young age that you knew what you wanted to do, did that get you onto the path a little bit earlier? Is there a way for people to join a little bit further along?
Well, consistency helps. Knowing what you want as early as possible and then consistently sticking with it is a very important characteristic. I never really have much advice to give people these days because things are changing so rapidly that my experience is definitely not going to be their experience, especially in the field of animation. Animation now is hotter than ever, and it is a big, big, big industry. So there's a lot of work. I think that the future of this industry in general, and by that I mean television, entertainment, movies, is that there's going to be a lot more product made, but you're probably going to get paid a lot less for it. And this is why writers are currently on strike, is because this is exactly what's happening. I've been predicting this for years. So there's going to be a lot more made, and it's going to be harder and harder to make a career out of it, to do it as a living. There are several reasons for that. First of all, the technology is being so good at doing it, number one, that it's only a matter of time before a very small team of people and producers can pretty much do more of the process than ever before. So there will be fewer and fewer hires. There will be a lot more product made, so there will be that, but it'll be hard to stay in one place. You know, like when I started my career, I was at Hanna Barbera for several years, just being a staff writer. I don't know that that position is ever going to exist in an animation company ever again. And then there are a lot more people. You know, the colleges have been graduating lots and lots of people who have gotten degrees in animation, something that wasn't even a possibility when I was in college. So now there are a lot more people in the workforce, and the competition is very tough. So I'm not sure you could make a living at it the way that I have. I've been working for 40 years and I'm still working, but I don't know if that's going to be available to a 20-year-old who's just getting their career going right now. So my advice is to just persevere and don't take yourself too seriously and seize every opportunity that comes your way. I think the biggest dilemma facing young people today is choice. People think they have they have choice. There are a lot of distractions, and there are a lot of different opportunities, and it's very hard to stay focused. And that may even be a dilemma for society, who knows, but there are a lot of distractions and it's very hard to stay focused. So if you just stay focused in one area, you stand a greater chance of success than if you're kind of jumping from one thing to the next.
Yeah, that makes sense. Definitely considering how, the whole climate would have changed behind the scenes from when you first started to now. And even from a viewer perspective, just rewatching some of the old shows compared to now, there's it's almost, and maybe it's nostalgia in part, but I like to look back at some of, the shows that came before as a bit of a golden era. And, I couldn't help but admiring the background that you're in currently with all the Spider-Man, and that whole era just strikes me as such a golden age for both animation, but Spider-Man in general. So how did you, begin work on Spider-Man, the animated series?
I got a phone call from Stan Lee, and he said, "We're in trouble. John, can you come over here and help us out?" That's another whole long story, but I had known Stan at that point for a decade. I had been a big Marvel Comics fan, and ultimately Stan and I ended up working together in the 80s at a company called Marvel Productions. And then 10 years later, when they were trying to get Spider-Man off the ground, they were about to fire their head writer. And he called me up and said, "Can you come over? We're in trouble. We may not get a show on the air, and I'm really worried. And would you help us out?" So I came running over. But by that time, I had been a showrunner of animation for quite some time. and I had a lot of experience, and he knew that I could get a show out the door. So it was beyond my writing years. I had been a writer initially, but then I became a showrunner, writer, head writer type person, producer person. And by that time I was pretty adept at that, and pretty well known and fairly highly regarded. So I was actually working on another show at the time, and I dropped that show and came over to Spider-Man. So that's the Spider-Man story. We could do hours just talking about Spider-Man.
Oh yeah, we absolutely could. Like Spider-Man's always been my favorite superhero of all time, and usually when we do these zooms, like I'm kind of used to our background for all we're in an awful quality camera being almost like the most impressive in a way. But like you've definitely completely smashed our background, because I'm almost trying to identify all of them there, because there's just so many interesting things, but also so many different versions of the Spider-Man character in general. And so, obviously, like looking online and remembering the show, of course, you debuted the whole concept of the Spider-Verse. And I wanted to know, like, how did this idea come about?
Well, I was very lucky to know that I had 65 episodes. Once I signed my contract or renewal, because my initial contract was for 13 episodes, and there were periods of time where they were pretty much going to fire me. Avi Arad pretty much had decided to fire me, and then he found out that he couldn't, and that's another long story. But by the time I signed my extension, we had reconciled our differences, as they say. And then I knew I had all these episodes to play with, so I decided that I would make it one big epic story. So even though the episodes are individual episodes, I would be building up to a big, magnificent climax. And it slowly began to take shape in my head. We had introduced this trans-dimensional portal technology in one of our episodes, and I had used it in a number of episodes in a lot of different ways. I started using it in a way as a metaphor for death. So when Mary Jane fell off the bridge, as Gwen Stacy had in the comic books, instead of having her die, I had her fall through a dimensional portal. And that was kind of like death without really doing death. But once I had introduced that technology, I had all kinds of plot availabilities that I could utilize. And I thought, well, what else can I do with this? And as I was building to an end, I thought, wouldn't it be wonderful to have a whole bunch of different Spider-Men from a bunch of different dimensions, each of whom had their own different life experience, if they all had to come together to save all of reality. I thought, there's nothing bigger than saving all of reality. This is the way every superhero should go out at the end of their series, is to save all of reality. And once I settled on the saving all of reality, then I thought about the dimensions, and I thought about, let's bring in different Spider-Man. And then it also tied in with toys. When I was a kid, it always really irritated me if you bought a toy and it wasn't exactly like the character that you loved on screen. And back in those days, toy makers didn't care about that kind of thing. So, you get Huckleberry Hound and he'd be red instead of blue as a toy. And that really irritated me. And Avi and his company Toy Biz had come out with a lot of different Spider-Men that had never been in my show. And I thought, well, if I'm a kid and I bought, Octo Spidey, and then I watch the show and he's never there, that's kind of a ripoff. And I thought, so all these ideas are swirling together. And finally, I thought, well, what if all these different Spider-Men represent some of those toys that never got into my show? So that's where we get the Octo Spider-Man, and we get a few of the others. And then also Ben Reilly was being really big in the comic books at that moment. And I thought that'd be a good way to get him into this show. So it all just kind of came together. I mean, this is what I do for a living. Is I am an idea generator, and I was looking for a really good idea for the end of my series. Nobody was more surprised than I was when I was watching that damn movie. And I'm slowly thinking, wait a minute, they're doing the end of my series. That kind of came as a surprise to me. It's a great movie. I love the film, but it really was an iteration of what I had done in the animated series, and what I had done in the animated series sprang from my head. There was no comic book precedent. Nobody gave me the plot concept. It was just something that I had created for a big ending for my series. So yes, I am the creator of the Spider-Verse for what it's worth.
Yeah, definitely an absolutely golden idea. I mean, just remembering how it was like to first react to all of that, it's just absolutely crazy. And really, it's probably the best superhero concept that's ever happened. Of course, as you've mentioned with some of like the things that they're trying to do now, it's definitely an idea that a lot of people resonate with. And yeah, I can't help but like look at, say, some of the stuff you've put on Facebook, for instance. I think you posted, maybe it was a couple of days ago, that you met Alfred Molina, who of course contributed to that Spider-Verse relatively recently. And so I wanted to ask, have you ever met anyone, for all I would consider you a legend yourself, have you ever met anyone and have been like almost starstruck in their presence at all?
I made it a point to do that. Um, I was lucky enough to be able to work personally with George Lucas, and that was pretty exciting because I was at Skywalker Ranch and I was in his office. And that was for a project that he did for an organization that he has called the George Lucas Educational Foundation, or GLEF. And I did a project where I got to work personally with him, and that was amazing. That was every bit as amazing as you would expect it to be, especially being up at Skywalker Ranch, which is just a beautiful, stunning place to be. Working with Stan Lee. Stan had always been a huge hero of mine. I had started reading Marvel Comics when I was 15, just as they were getting started. So I read all the first issues of Spider-Man and Fantastic Four and Iron Man. And I mean, I was there when they all started. So I was a huge fan of Stan's, and getting to work with him, meeting him in the 80s and getting to work with him was one of the high points of my life. And then I did a show for Jim Henson. I did the animated Fraggle Rock, and I had always been a huge Jim Henson fan. And getting to work personally with Jim and getting to know him and getting to spend time around all the Muppets and getting to write for the Muppets and getting to meet all the Muppeteers, that was pretty exciting. One or two Disney people that I've met, Disney animators. I mean, for me coming out here in 1979, so many of my heroes were still around that I really aggressively made it a point to meet as many of them as I could. People like Chuck Jones. I got to work with Friz Freleng over at Hanna Barbera. I got to meet Bill and Joe, obviously, being in Hanna Barbera. The first recording session I ever went to was the Flintstones with the original cast. And so, meeting Mel Blanc. Mel Blanc was the voice of Barney Rubble, but he was also the voice of Mr. Spacely when I wrote a Jetsons. And then, of course, Mel Blanc being the voice of Bugs Bunny, Sylvester, Tweety, Daffy Duck, I mean, that's cartoon royalty. So the fact that I got to meet all of those people back in those days, the early 80s, was tremendously exciting for me. And then working with, to bring it back to Scooby, working with Frank Welker, Don Messick, Casey Kasem, all those people who had done the voices from the very beginning. That was very exciting, to be in a recording studio and realize that I'm now writing the words that they're speaking. So.
And that certainly, you've mentioned some incredible things there. And I think the last point you finished on with the Scooby thing is certainly an era we're excited to focus in on. So do you remember how your work with Hanna Barbera started?
Yes, I was working as an editor at Universal. No, let me go back even further. I started, my first real work out here was in post-production. I was a film editor. I was in the editors union. and I was working as a film editor, and I'd started at a company called Ruby Spears. And if you know anything about Scooby, which I assume you do, you know that Joe Ruby and Ken Spears created Scooby. So they eventually spun off their own company, and I started working at their company. When they, in film in general, back then you would get laid off every year. So you get laid off and then you get rehired. So, it was seasonal work. So they'd bring you on for a season and then they'd let you go. And then at one point they laid us off. I think I was there for 2 seasons. And at the end of the second season, they laid us off. And then a whole bunch of us in editorial went over to Hanna Barbera. And so I started working in the basement in editorial. Film editorial. We were actually handling 35 millimeter film back in those days. And I was working for Hanna Barbera in the basement, and I was meeting all the producers, and many of whom had had amazing careers and had worked with Bill and Joe on Tom and Jerry cartoons and had worked at Disney. And, they were all luminaries in their own right. Alex Lovey was there. He had designed Woody Woodpecker for Walter Lantz. So that was really fun. I really enjoyed that work. And then while I was there, I met my significant other, Cynthia Friedloeb. And when I left Hanna Barbera, we had started a relationship. And when I left Hanna Barbera, I started working on movies. So I was at Universal working on a movie called DC Cab. And Cynthia had been working upstairs. She'd originally been working in the music department at Hanna Barbera, but then she was working upstairs in Margaret's office, Margaret Lash. And then they had their own round of layoffs, but Margaret didn't like to let people go. So her way of letting people go would be to let them be a writer. So Cynthia came home one day and said, well, I've been laid off. And I said, really? And she went, well, they offered me a chance to be a writer, but I'm not going to do it. And I said, well, no, go do it. I sat with all those producers. I know what they're looking for, and I know how to write a Scooby cartoon. And I had been an animation buff my whole life, so I knew what a good cartoon was. And I certainly knew what a Scooby was because I had sat in editorial with all the producers and with the network. I knew all the network people. So I said, well, tell them you'll be a writer, and then I will write at night when I come home from work, and you can type it up because I'm a crap typist even to this day. I'm a horrible typist, and you can edit it, and we'll be a writing team. And that's how it started. So she went in during the day, and we started selling scripts to ABC, and we became 2 of their most popular writers, primarily for Scooby, because that was what was going on at the time. And that was the very first cartoon we wrote, was a Scooby-Doo cartoon called Scoobsy, which was a takeoff on the Dustin Hoffman movie Tootsie, which was really popular right at that moment. It had just come out. And then we sold so many scripts that Margaret came to Cynthia one day and said, well, who's this John Semper that you're writing with? And she said, well, he used to work down in the basement in editorial, and he's working on movies over at Universal. And she said, well, ask him if he wants to come over here and be on staff. So I left the movie that I was editing on, that I was working on, and came to Hanna Barbera as a staff writer. And I was on staff at H&B for a couple of years.
Oh. I mean, you elaborated on that a little bit further online, and that you wrote that your hiring with Hanna Barbera in 1982 actually made you the first Black staff writer, and of course, you've been a first in that regard for a number of things as well. Did this add any additional struggles or obstacles for you? And if so, how did you overcome those?
Well, it's always an obstacle because racism exists, and it's inherent in in our society. And for a lot of people, it's blatant. For some people, it's blatant. For a lot of people, it's just sort of invisible, and they're not aware of it. And by that, I'm talking about not people of color per se. So it's always a barrier. You're always battling it on some level. I'm still battling it now. But that being said, the cool thing about animation back at that moment, right at that moment in time, was that all the older white guys were sort of retiring and or dying off. And there was a genuine need for new blood. So there's that. So a lot of the old guys who had written cartoons during my childhood were now retiring. And they were, and at the same time, Hanna-Barbera was selling more shows than ever before. So there was a genuine need for talent. That being said, the other thing that really helped was that cartoons were considered something of an industry ghetto at that particular time. And so the competition wasn't as fierce to get into it as it is today. Now, mind you, there were a lot of people who wanted to get into it, but it's not like today where cartoons are cool. You know, now you've got Rick and Morty, and you've got, you know, you've had The Simpsons for a number of decades, and you got all these cool cartoon shows. So everybody, you've got all these kids graduating from college, and they want to make cool cartoon shows for Adult Swim or for Nickelodeon or for Fox Animation Domination, or, you know, I mean, there's this whole, it's got cachet now. It did not have cachet back in 1980 or 81 or 82. The things that were cool were sitcoms and movies, and, you know, and so people who wanted to get into the industry did not think in terms of cartoons. That being said, when I was at Marvel Productions and we were making a lot of Hasbro things like My Little Pony and stuff like that, my first show running gig was for the My Little Pony show, and it was a segment called Moon Dreamers. That was the first time I ran a show, and one of the guys who wrote for me and was one office down from me was Chuck Lorre, creator of The Big Bang Theory. So, you know, now when I go with friends to take a tour of Warner Brothers Studios, there's the Chuck Lorre building. And when I go to the TV Academy at an event, there's the bust of Chuck Lorre because he's in the TV Academy Hall of Fame. He started out in cartoons. And obviously he's done well for himself, but it was not a place that anyone wanted to be. And that helped, because those of us who got established, as I did, we had the field to ourselves for a good number of decades. I'd say a couple of decades before all the other people started flooding in the way it is now. So yeah, you know, that I think, and I've totally forgotten your question, but it had something to do with, you know, to what do I attribute my success or something of that sort. I think that it was both of those things. Oh, it had to do with, did I encounter barriers being the first Black? Yeah, I mean, there were barriers, but they were not insurmountable. And I've been jumping over barriers my entire career, my entire life. So this was just another one. In fact, I wrote an animated feature that came out last summer, Green Lantern, Beware My Power. And my favorite line in it that I wrote was when they tell him that he is completely vulnerable to the color yellow, being a Green Lantern. They have no power over anything that's yellow. He said, I've been up against a color barrier my whole life. I'm not going to let that stop me. And that's sort of my motto.
Well, I think, you know, certainly that's been such a, you know, so important to hear about as well. I think I know that, I think, like you said, in terms of really establishing, like you said, having those 2 decades in terms of animation and things like that, I think as well that's kind of the forefront of why it has become the success that it has now. Like, animation, like you say, is respected on a level that, you know, 30-40 years ago, certainly, you know, I grew up with parents who were watching, you know, children's shows 60 years ago, and I wasn't allowed to watch animation because they just didn't see it as the value that it had, because they hadn't watched it within that time frame. And so, you know, I didn't exactly have the joys that you did of seeing Scooby Doo at quite as much of a young age. And so I guess kind of hopping back onto Scooby a little bit, I know you said you were working on it from quite an early stage. How familiar were you with, you know, the franchise of Scooby Doo before working on it?
Well, I've always hated when I hear an interview with someone and, you know, they're interviewing someone about making a Star Trek movie or you know, writing a popular franchise, and the first words that come out of their mouth are, I was never a big fan of blah blah blah. You know, they say, I was never a big fan of Star Trek, or I was never a big fan, and I always want to smack my head and in frustration. But having said that, I was never a big fan of Scooby Doo. Mostly it was a question of timing. By the time Scooby was created and was on the air, I was sort of a preteen or teenager. And the concept, I probably wasn't watching very much Saturday morning cartoons at that point, very many Saturday morning cartoons. And I certainly wasn't terribly attracted to this particular character because he was just kind of a big goofy dog, and my era for being attracted to big goofy dogs was over. If I had been 5 or 6, I would have probably loved Scooby-Doo, or at least watched it. By the time Scooby-Doo came on, I really didn't pay any attention to it. I just wasn't watching a lot of cartoons. I think I'd moved on. I think I discovered film in general, and I was probably watching, short silent films by George Méliès and experimental films and all that kind of stuff. I was firmly ensconced in the filmmaking revolution of the 1960s. So Scooby-Doo, I was never a fan. Never, ever, ever. I wasn't really exposed to Scooby in any meaningful way until I worked as an editor at Hanna Barbera, and I edited a lot of Scoobies. So I became very familiar with the character just from having it on my moviola and sitting with the producers and figuring out retakes and figuring out how to cut errors out and things of that sort. And that's when I actually watched Scooby-Doo for the first time, was when it was on my moviola. And then getting to know the network people and what they liked and disliked and things of that sort. When I started writing at Hanna Barbera, Scooby was one of the first things that they were sort of desperate for writers for. And I thought, well, I know how to write a Scooby because I've watched a number of them at that point. And it wasn't what I considered to be a very challenging concept. And so in a way, my lack of familiarity and my lack of love for it was a help. Because every time I do a Scooby, I would always try to think of, well, what's an interesting twist that I could put on it that will really excite me? So I'm not terribly excited by these characters because they sort of go through the same motions over and over again, or at least they did back then. I think they've done some really cool things with Scooby and the gang, within the last couple of decades. But back when I started, it was pretty formulaic, and we were doing the 11-minute ones, and they had already introduced Scrappy, and I thought, okay, every cartoon that I write, I'm going to try to find an interesting angle that brings something new to Scooby and also is something that I like. So I'm a big Zorro fan. So I thought, what if Scooby gets bonked on the head and wakes up in old Los Angeles and is now Zorro? So I did The Mark of Scooby, which is still one of my favorite Scooby cartoons. I told you about the first one was Scoobsy. That really was just getting my foot in the door. It's like, well, let me just write a standard Scooby cartoon that everybody will then say, oh, wow, you really know how to write Scooby. But I still would try to bring a kind of a funny twist to it. I'd been a cartoon historian, so I knew about the Warner Brothers cartoons, the great cartoons of Chuck Jones, Friz Freleng, and whatnot. I ended up working with Friz at Hanna Barbera on a Pink Panther show. But at any rate, I knew what a funny cartoon was. And so I tried to always bring some of that zany Warner Brothers humor as much as you could back in those days. And I think that's one of the reasons why ABC liked us as writers, because we did bring something new and fresh. And that really did come from me not being all that in love with the characters. I looked back on one of the cartoons recently that I'd totally forgotten, and it was kind of like a takeoff of Sunset Boulevard with a reclusive actress who didn't want her face to ever be seen. And I totally forgotten this cartoon. I can't even tell you the name of it right now. But, I'm an old movie buff, so doing Sunset Boulevard as a Scooby cartoon appealed to me. There's one cartoon that I did where it happened right after the Twilight Zone deaths. I don't know if you kids, you guys are young, but when they made a Twilight Zone movie that Spielberg produced. They were shooting a scene with a helicopter late at night. They had kids on the set in the scene, and that was illegal. And they had a lead actor named Vic Morrow, and they were shooting a scene, and the helicopter hit a power line or something, and crashed, and the rollerblades killed Vic Morrow and the two kids. And the filmmakers went to court. They were, they were arrested, and they went to court, and they were ultimately acquitted. But it was a big deal. The Twilight Zone trial was a big deal, and it was happening. And I just thought that was absolutely insane. I don't think anyone should ever die when making a movie. The medium isn't that important. No one should ever lose their life. So I did a Scooby cartoon that was really my statement about that, called The Fall Dog, which was ostensibly based on the TV show The Fall Guy, but it really wasn't, because I've never seen an actual episode of The Fall Guy. What it was about, though, was it was about all the daring stunts that a very sort of ambitious director makes Scooby and Scrappy go through as stunt people. And they're all life-threatening, and then there's a mystery happening on the set where someone's trying to kill someone else. But that was very much inspired by the Twilight Zone accident, because it was unconscionable that these kids were on the set late at night, two little kids, and were killed. So I would always try to find some interesting twist to bring to Scooby-Doo. I think my Scooby-Doo cartoons, prior to the new ones, which I think are really quite clever and wonderful, but I think my Scoobies were actually pretty strange for their day. Oh, and then also I'm a big Sherlock Holmes fan. So I did Sherlock Scooby, which strangely enough is not in rotation. I think it's because they probably got sued by the Conan Doyle estate or something, maybe. But that's a very hard one to find. You can still find it online, though. But I did Sherlock Scooby, and that was my love for Sherlock Holmes. So I always tried to find some interesting way of making a different kind of Scooby cartoon.
Maybe a nice vision just tilted to the side there, because somewhere here,
there's meant to be literally a toy of Scooby-Doo dressed up as Sherlock,
and we've got it somewhere.
and it's gone walkabout somewhere. But
Okay.
I'll have to send like an image of that across. But I do agree, I think all of the Scoobies that you've done have definitely either had a breath of fresh air as far as a quirkiness to it, or like something a little bit different. Like Scoobsy always stood out to me as being one that had a particular wit to it that not a lot of the Scoobies around that era had. It always sticks out to me when you've got Scooby that pretends to be this actress, and then everyone wants her to be a rising star, and then the disguise comes off. The network person says, "Oh, you're a dog," and Scooby just replies with, "Well, I never." Like it just seemed to have a little bit more of a wit to it, and I love that. I love, like you say, like the Scoobies that were taking place on a movie set or a TV show set, like Scoobsy was. Do you know where that original idea for Scoobsy originally came about?
Well, for Scoobsy, it was mine, and my idea was to do a takeoff of Tootsie, the movie Tootsie, which was about a man who can't get work as an actor. So he poses as a woman, and then he gets hired onto a soap opera, and he becomes a big star, and nobody knows that he's really a man. And it was a Dustin Hoffman movie. It was a very successful movie. He might have won an Academy Award for it, but it was certainly an Academy Award-winning film, hugely popular. And at that particular time, I had seen so many Scooby cartoons, most of which I thought were pretty dreadful. So, I was editing on the cartoons where Lenny Weinrib was still doing Scrappy's voice, and he made him sound like a bookie from the Bronx, and they weren't really very good. And I did not want to make that kind of a cartoon, but I did notice that ABC loved it when Scooby or Shaggy were in drag, and ABC loved it when they stopped for Scooby snacks. There were certain beats that ABC loved, and I knew them by that time. So my goal with Scoobsy, first of all, you have to sell a premise. You have to, have an idea that they want to buy. I'm working on a new show right now, and we're struggling to come up with premises and getting premises approved. And so that's the first step, is you have to have a really good idea that they get excited about. And so I thought, well, let's just do something based on the hit movie of the moment. And that's a relatively easy sale. So ABC said, yes, we want to do that. And then, of course, you've got Scooby and Drag, and you've got Scooby wanting Scooby snacks, and you make sure you hit all those beats that they're looking for. Then I would try to put in the funny stuff, the genuinely funny stuff, which is what I thought a lot of the earlier Scoobies that I had edited. So those would be, 11-minute Scoobies that weren't particularly very good. I would try to make my Scoobies genuinely funny in a kind of a Warner Brothers way. And I put a lot of physical gags in, and a lot of wordplay, and I would always try to base my Scoobies on some interesting concept that, a lot of people, for instance, hate Scrappy Doo. And for me, I loved Scrappy because Scrappy was really funny. There was just something funny about this little pugnacious dog that always wanted to get into a fight and didn't seem to understand how small he was. And, and the other two are cowards. Shaggy and Scooby are cowards, but Scrappy was always ready to get in and fight the monster, and he'd have to be grabbed by the collar and pulled away. And I just thought he was hilarious. So all this hatred for Scrappy, I never felt. For me, he was a breath of fresh air because he was genuinely funny. And I always wanted my cartoons to be genuinely funny. So.
Yeah, it is interesting because, like you said, before that point, Scooby-Doo had become very formulaic. It was a formula that worked clearly, but it was very rinse and repeat. And a lot of the stuff that they've done nowadays has been like elevating some of the underutilized members of Mystery Inc. So making Fred a lot more, giving him a lot more of a personality, and Velma almost giving her a little Sherlock treatment as well. But back when you were writing that, Scooby-Doo and Scrappy show, they'd almost done away with Fred and Velma completely. So for all you didn't dislike Scrappy at all, do you think it would have changed your style or how you would have written some of the humor if instead of Scrappy they'd had a Fred or Velma in the mix at all?
Oh, sure. It would have been very different. It would have been absolutely different. I would have tried to find real personalities for them. I'm a very personality-based writer. I like to write from personality. So I would have defined their personalities because they really didn't have any, at that point. The cartoons that I edited on were genuinely dreadful. They're just dreadful. And I knew, and again, that was a help because I knew I could do better than that. I always tell writing students and whatnot, when you're feeling depressed, go watch a really bad movie and then realize that that person that wrote that bad movie got that movie sold and got that movie made. And if they can do that, then you can too. So the fact that Scoobies were really dreadful when I was editing them made me feel very confident as a writer that I could write better than that. And sure enough, I could. So, but yes, I definitely would have if I had had the full cast to play with, but we didn't. At that point, the network and the powers that be had decided that they only wanted to do 11-minute cartoons and that they didn't want the other two characters. And that was okay. That's you work with what you're given. The following year, and I forget the timing in there, but we did the 13 Ghosts of Scooby Doo, where we had Vincent Van Ghoul, and that was a new fun character to play with, not to mention the fact that I got to meet Vincent Price. So that was a whole different kind of reality. I think I wrote 2 of those. It was a little more difficult because now you had to stretch a story out over 22 minutes as opposed to being 11 minutes. So I had to make that adjustment. I remember I got really lost in one script once, and I just started writing it like it was Alice in Wonderland, just sort of free form because I was frustrated. And when I handed it in, Tom Ruger, who was story editing it, started screaming at me, Alice in Wonderland, Alice in Wonderland. He just went nuts. And I turned to him and I said, Tom, I don't get paid enough for you to scream at me. And he calmed down, and we talked it over, and it ended up turning out okay. And I love Tom. Tom's a really good guy. And Tom, of course, went on to do Tiny Toons and to create, Pinky and the Brain and all that wonderful stuff. But we go way back to Hanna Barbera, and it was an adjustment. Suddenly now being responsible for a 22-minute mystery instead of an 11-minute mystery, but it was great fun having Vincent Van Gogh, new character to play with. So I didn't really miss the other characters, and again, because I had not been a fan, I didn't really know them at all anyway. And I think it's been really cool that in all the recent stuff, they have expanded those characters and given us an opportunity to get to know them better. I'm not really fond of the Velma show, which I think is sort of borderline horrible. But I think the characters are incredibly durable. I had a wonderful experience when I wrote the Green Lantern movie. We shot the press, the extras for it in this gigantic airplane hangar where all of Warner Brothers props and material properties are located. They're not at the studio. It's a separate hangar somewhere in North Hollywood, secret location in North Hollywood. And I shot my interview segments for the Green Lantern movie in that bunker. And they came to me and they said, would you like a tour? And I said, sure. So we're walking around, we're looking at the cars from Supernatural, and we're looking at they've got about 4 mystery machines, and looking at all the new costumes for all the superheroes. And then the guy says, come on over here, I want to show you something. You worked at Hanna Barbera, right? And I said, yeah, a long time ago. He said, come on over here, I want to show you something. So we go over to a wall of drawers. And I mean, this is a huge place. It's like maybe even 2 airplane hangars joined together. And he goes over to this wall of drawers and he pulls out a drawer, and inside is the original artwork by Iwo Takamoto, whom I knew back in the day. It's Iwo's original artwork that they used that when Joe and Ken pitched Scooby Doo. It's the very first Scooby Doo drawing ever. This is like the Shroud of Turin, but Scooby Doo style. And it was just breathtaking, to see this original piece of art that had been used to sell this franchise of these incredibly durable, long-lasting characters.
Wow, that just sounds absolutely breathtaking, and it's just so interesting hearing you talk about this whole era of Scooby-Doo, which is definitely, I think, such a great era of change. I mean, like you've mentioned with Tom Ruger, I think we interviewed him a couple of months ago about a pup named Scooby-Doo, which again changed the formula dramatically to the point where they really did do a lot of different with Scooby-Doo. And of course, maybe like you say with the new Velma show, that's translated to a couple of misfires here and there, but it's something new that maybe in a couple of years, next year, they'll have something that's dramatically different that does work a bit better, which I think is really exciting. And I guess the most recent thing you did with Scooby was the 13 Ghosts of Scooby Doo, as you mentioned, and that did a lot different in regards to introducing real supernatural threats into the mix. Like, do you feel like that was a good direction for the show to take at all?
Oh, sure. It was fun. It loosened things up. You got Vincent Price in his prime, as opposed to the older man that he was at that particular moment. So you got to see him in this cartoon form, and he was really cool. I think Tom did a really good job. I mean, Tom really is like the leading living Scooby-Doo-ologist in many ways, because he handles so many iterations of Scooby, and he did a really great job with it. So I enjoyed working with Tom. I think that 13 Ghosts has its own fan base and has its own cachet, and I'm very delighted to have worked on it. I think the production value is pretty good. The great thing about Hanna Barbera back in those days was you could literally walk through the building and watch the cartoon being made, because they were still doing a lot of the animating there. They were still doing all the backgrounds there. And I remember walking around and seeing some of the painted backgrounds that were genuine works of art. You know, it was a wonderful incubator of talent at Hanna-Barbera. Think of all the people that came out of H&B and went on to do great things. And there were so many talented artists there. Floyd Norman, if you know who Floyd is, was there. I met Floyd first when somebody took me on a tour over at the ink and paint department, and he was in his little cubicle, and that was where I first met him. So there were a lot of really wonderful, brilliant people there. And I think that a show like 13 Ghosts really looks great. It's just a really beautiful looking Scooby show before the current wave of Scooby shows that are really magnificent. And, you know, I don't mean to be unkind to Velma, but I have to be truthful. You know, I watched it and I was mostly sort of horrified, because I think you can only stretch a concept so far in a certain direction. And that one, it's like the more recent Muppet show that was on ABC, where, you know, there were the Muppets, but it was just not really the venue for them, this sort of adult primetime venue. And I think it's really important to always remember the essence of why a franchise works, so that when you try to do new things with it, you don't lose the spirit of what it's all about. One of the greatest compliments that they ever paid me on Spider-Man, I would run into fans at that time, and they would say, it's just like the comic book. In point of fact, I changed a lot of things that were in the comic book. And in a lot of ways it wasn't, but it felt like it was just like the comic book. And I think that's the thing you have to be careful about, is you have to always retain the spirit of the original franchise that you're playing with. And I think Velma doesn't do that. I think if they had just done a whole separate show and called it some other character, that would have worked better than trying to make that be Velma.
Yeah, I think if you understand the essence of the character inside and out, you can change it in whatever way you feel necessary, really. Like, if there's one thing that I love about your take on Spider-Man, is that for maybe a lot of things were different from the source material, it's like you really, really understood Peter Parker at his core, and so that's why all the changes and adjustments worked. I think the issue with Velma is it changed a lot, and it didn't necessarily understand all of the characters and what they would do, wouldn't do, and even if they were to change a bit, it was to a point where it didn't feel like you were watching them in another take. So I think that's kind of where that fell apart quite a bit.
Yeah, I agree. I totally agree. I think you have to be true to what makes the thing popular in the first place.
Certainly. And I think, you know, we're talking about the 13 Ghosts there, and I think, you know, really that is a fantastic area of Scooby to call back to. And you were saying there about your memories, just being able to walk down the corridor at Warner Brothers, and I think it's such a shame now that most things are done remotely, from the voice recordings to the artwork. I just imagine it's not the same experience at all. So for you, do you have a favorite memory from when you were working over at Hanna Barbera?
Yes, I mean, I have many favorite memories. And Hanna Barbera was not Warner's at that time. So it really was Hanna Barbera, and they were in the same building that they had been in since almost the beginning. So they were in the Hanna Barbera building at that time, and really the place was just infused with history. You know, you would go into the recording booth, and it was the same recording booth where they had recorded all the original cast of the Flintstones and Huckleberry Hound, and we were still working with all the same voice people: Dawes Butler, Don Messick. I mean, Dawes Butler and Don Messick were all the voices of all the early Hanna-Barbera characters, with John Stevenson also coming in every now and then. So those three alone, just meeting them and working with them and writing for them, was really exciting for me. Seeing them in the booth when I was sitting there watching Gordon Hunt direct. Gordon Hunt, very famous theater director here in LA, and the father of Helen Hunt. He was our voiceover director, and watching him direct all of these actors, and we had guest actors who came in from time to time, was really an exciting experience for me. One of the best times, going back to 13 Ghosts of Scooby Doo, was I forget what happened. I might have gone to the men's room or something, and right at that moment, Cynthia, who had gone to the recording session for 13 Ghosts, had asked Vincent Price if he would wait for a minute because she knew that I wanted to meet him. So they were standing in the parking lot waiting, and no one could find me. And they were announcing my name over the PA system, which didn't have a speaker in the men's room. So I had no idea that this was going on. And I finally, meandered out of the men's room only to hear that I was wanted out in the parking lot. And bless his heart, Vincent Price stood there and waited with Cynthia for them to find me. And then I came out and I was thoroughly delighted. And I think I had him autograph the storyboard that I had in my hand, or Cynthia had very wisely brought a storyboard out so that I do have his autograph. We weren't into picture taking so much back in those days because film cost money and we didn't carry cameras around in our pockets the way we do now in our phones. So I don't have really very many pictures. But I certainly wish that I had taken a picture with Vincent Price because he was just delightful, just the sweetest man. I have a rule, which is that the people who play the meanest villains in movies and TV are always the sweetest people in any given situation. They're always the nicest people on the set. It's the heroes you have to watch out for. Behind the scenes, those people are demons. But the ones who play villains are always just the nicest people. Vincent Price was wonderful. I just this past weekend met, I don't know if you watched the TV show The Boys, but one of the big villain characters is a superhero named Homelander. And he's just mean and awful and does all kinds of horrible things. And I just met the guy on Sunday, and he's just an absolute delight. He's charming and he's funny, and I did get a picture with him, but he's just the nicest person. And I thought to myself, well, there you go. It's always the bad guy that's the nicest person. Vincent Price was not a disappointment. It was really a thrill to meet him. One time I was in my office and I had a Disney calendar on my wall, and every month was a different image or drawing. And that particular month, there was a sketch, there was original art drawing, black and white pencil drawing of Mickey, Donald, and Goofy from a very famous classic cartoon called Clock Cleaners, which was probably made in the 1930s. And one of our artists, Chuck Couch, who was very old at the time, he's walking down the hall, and then he kind of looked in my office. Now, I had never spoken to Chuck really at length about anything. And I thought, why is he looking in my office? And he came into my office and he starts walking closer and closer toward my desk. And I thought, Chuck Couch is now wanting to talk to me. What is this all about? And then I realized he wasn't looking at me. He was looking past me, and he was looking at the drawing on the wall of Mickey, Donald, and Goofy on this giant clock. And he looks at it very closely and he goes, yeah, I think that's one of mine. And then he turns around and walks out. And that's what would happen at Hanna Barbera. You were surrounded by all these guys who had made all these classic Tom and Jerry and Walt Disney cartoons. So I have a lot of great memories of working at Hanna Barbera.
It certainly does sound incredible. And it's been so interesting to hear your stories and speak with you today. I guess we are kind of getting to the end of our questions and kind of moving on to talking about the future. So do you have any upcoming projects at all that you can talk about yet?
I do. First of all, everybody should find me on Facebook. I think it's facebook.com/John Semper or John Semper Jr., maybe John Semper Jr. I'm not quite sure, but I'm not hard to find. I am currently working on a show that will be out in 2025 called Weather Hunters, which is the creation of Al Roker, the weatherman here in the United States, who is on every morning a very popular, successful show called The Today Show. And he's been on for several decades, so he's extremely well known. This is a show that he created. It's a family called the Hunters, and basically it's a cartoon version of him, and he is a weatherman, and his kids learn all about science and weather through him, and we are just getting underway. I just finished writing the pilot. In fact, I'm not finished writing the pilot. this afternoon we're going to have a discussion about the next draft. So I'm in the middle of working even as we speak. I think we're meeting at about 1:30 my time, which is an hour and a half from now. So that's what I'm working on right at the moment. I have there's a graphic novel that is being kickstarted right at the moment based on my favorite television show of the 80s, Robin of Sherwood. It's a very mystical, fantastic retelling of Robin Hood, the Robin Hood myth. You all remember it, you all know it because it was aired there in the UK and it was extremely popular in its day. I'm doing a graphic novel based on the show that actually brings the two Robin Hoods. There were two Robin Hoods in the series, and this graphic novel brings them together. So we are kickstarting that. I would appreciate it if everyone would go find that on Indiegogo. Indiegogo. We're doing that. And if people would find it and pledge to buy it, that would be tremendously helpful. Got a wonderful artist on that, a guy named Alan Jefferson, with whom I did Cyborg. I wrote the Cyborg comic for DC for about a year. And Alan was one of my favorite artists. I had a couple of really great artists on that. Will Conrad was another. But what else am I plugging? I don't know. I'm always out there selling and hustling and trying to make new things happen. So if you come to my Facebook page, find me on Facebook. It's public. You don't even have to become a friend. Everything that's on it is open to the public. And I announce all the things that I'm up to there. And who knows? You never know what's going to happen. I mean, I might end up writing Scooby again someday. So that would be interesting. That would be interesting to start my career with Scooby and end my career with Scooby. But we'll see how it goes. Anyway, it's been great fun talking to you guys. I didn't even get a chance to show you my mystery machine.
Oh, wow.
That's a bank. Oh no, this is a lunchbox. I'm sorry. This is a mystery machine lunchbox. And what else have I got to show you? These are the only things I could get my hands on. This was a Scooby lamp. Can you see that?
Wow.
Somebody made this. There were not very many of these made. And it was almost sort of a limited run. Scooby and Scrappy, and these are clouds once the camera adjusts. And it's a really cool little lamp that we've had for a number of years. And I do have Scooby plushes, and I have the Scooby Matchbox toy mystery machine, and we do think very fondly of Scooby here in this household. I think I have a Scooby hand puppet in the other room, and I should have brought that. I should have just had that pop up right next to me. But we think very fondly of Scooby, and we live very close. We live 5 minutes away from Universal Studios here in Hollywood, and Cynthia and I went up a couple of years ago, and we got with the Scooby, the woman portraying Daphne and the big costume Scooby character. And we were in front of the big mystery machine, and we took a picture of ourselves. So that was really fun to just get our photo taken with Scooby and Daphne, and then whisper to them, we used to write the cartoons, and they were like, ooh, they were very excited about that. So that was pretty cool. Maybe I should even send that to you, and then you can have a copy of that. So anyway, thank you for having me on. This is always fun to reminisce about the past. I'm never at a loss for words. So thank you for letting me ramble on. And you guys are great keeping up the spirit of Scooby-Doo. I think that's really cool.
Well, thank you so much. We really do appreciate all the time today, and any of the links that you mentioned, I'll be able to leave in the description down below for people to go and follow and support. So just thank you so much for all the time today, and for the purpose of the video, thank you so much to everyone for watching. If you do want to follow what we're doing, I'll leave our link tree in the description down below as well. And if you do want to see more, then please like, comment, and subscribe, and we'll see you next time.